The neighborhood had always prided itself on appearances. Rows of identical lawns stretched across the street, clipped to perfection, green but lifeless, as if cut from the same template. The Homeowners Association called it uniform beauty, but to anyone with an eye for nature, it looked more like conformity stamped into grass. Every house stood painted in neutral shades, every hedge trimmed into rectangles, every flower bed limited to 2 safe choices approved by the board. At first, the garden that started all the trouble seemed harmless enough. It was just a patch of earth in front of a modest house on the corner lot. The owner, a quiet man who had recently moved in, began by pulling out strips of sod. In their place, he planted a strange mix. Wildflowers, herbs, climbing vines and shrubs that seemed far too chaotic for a neighborhood like this. The neighbors noticed. Some frowned. Others whispered that it looked out of place. But one person in particular, Karen, the president of the HOA, saw it as a direct challenge to her authority. Karen had long believed the neighborhood thrived because she enforced the rules. She lived in a pristine 2-story house with shutters painted HOA-approved navy blue and a lawn sprayed so often it seemed unnaturally green year-round. She kept clipboards in her kitchen drawer with the names of every homeowner and the potential violations she might watch for. To her, rules were not suggestions, they were weapons, and the appearance of that unruly patch of earth on the corner lot set her on edge immediately. She began her campaign quietly. She parked her SUV across the street under the excuse of making phone calls, all while staring at the garden like it was a crime scene. She scribbled notes about dandelions, overhanging vines, and the fact that the wildflowers did not match the HOA-approved color palette. To Karen, it was all evidence of disorder, a threat to the image she curated so carefully. Soon she took the next step, the official complaint. The letter arrived in the homeowner's mailbox, neatly typed on HOA letterhead with a tone both patronizing and severe. It accused the garden of being messy, non-compliant, and a distraction from the neighborhood's cohesive aesthetic. It demanded immediate removal of all unapproved plants and threatened fines if the work was not completed within 30 days. Most homeowners in the neighborhood would have caved under that pressure. The HOA was notorious for its relentless follow-ups. But this garden was different. Instead of vanishing, the plants grew taller. Instead of being trimmed away, the wildflowers bloomed brighter, spilling color across the yard. The herbs spread their fragrance into the air, carrying hints of rosemary, lavender, and mint every time the wind shifted. By midsummer, the yard no longer looked like an experiment. It looked like an explosion of life, a natural refuge in a neighborhood of rigid lines. Karen's fury grew in equal measure. She launched a series of escalations, submitting fines to the homeowner's account and rallying other board members to view the property as a threat. In her eyes, the garden was not just a violation of aesthetics, but a rebellion against her authority. She muttered to neighbors about lowered property values and eyesores, warning that if one person got away with breaking rules, others would follow. But behind Karen's outrage was another emotion she would never admit: jealousy. The garden attracted attention. Passers-by slowed down to take photographs. Children tugged at their parents' hands to see the bright blossoms. Even homeowners, who initially disliked the look, began to soften. They noticed bees and butterflies returning, small birds perching among the vines, and a kind of life that no square patch of sod could replicate. Karen, however, saw none of that. She saw only defiance. By autumn, the situation had escalated to community meetings. Karen made her case in front of the board, waving pictures of the garden as if they were crime scene evidence. She emphasized the messiness, the non-uniformity, and the threat to neighborhood order. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had always gotten her way. The board was divided. Some members nodded along with Karen, fearful of setting a precedent. Others hesitated, recognizing that the garden had become something unique, something neighbors were starting to appreciate despite the rules. The meeting ended with no resolution, only the promise of further investigation and the shadow of heavier fines. What Karen did not know, and what the neighborhood had not yet realized, was that the garden had already begun attracting attention far beyond their streets. A local passerby who admired its untamed beauty had shared photos online. The images spread quickly, praised for their creativity and natural design. Within weeks, a community gardening group contacted the homeowner, asking permission to feature the yard in an upcoming regional tour of sustainable landscapes. For the homeowner, it was both validation and opportunity. For Karen, though, it would soon be the spark of humiliation she never anticipated. The story of the garden was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. It was on its way to becoming something larger, something that would turn the HOA's strict rules upside down and leave Karen standing in the very spotlight she had tried to avoid. As winter approached and the plants curled into their seasonal rest, the seeds of conflict had only just been sown. The garden was not defeated. It was merely waiting for spring, and when it returned, it would not come back quietly. The days following the HOA's formal notice were marked by a mixture of tension and quiet determination. The homeowner, still shaken by the letter and the HOA president's piercing glare, resolved not to let the incident dictate the fate of the garden. Yet the sense of being watched lingered. Neighbors passed by on evening strolls, some slowing down to observe the yard with an expression that hinted at silent judgment. Others avoided eye contact altogether, as if siding with the HOA president by default, fearful of becoming her next target. The garden itself, however, became a canvas of resilience. With every letter the HOA sent, every frown Karen cast, the homeowner poured more energy into cultivating life. Rows of native wildflowers sprouted along the walkway. Tall sunflowers turned their heads toward the morning sun. Bees hummed, butterflies fluttered, and the space came alive in a way no perfectly trimmed hedge ever could. The irony was sharp. While the HOA insisted on conformity, the garden reflected the truest spirit of community, nurturing, colorful, and alive. Karen, however, was relentless. She escalated her campaign, enlisting other board members. During HOA meetings, she spoke with the intensity of someone on a personal crusade. Words like unsightly, devaluing property, and neighborhood standards became her arsenal. The homeowner, absent from these meetings, became the silent subject of heated debates, while Karen gestured dramatically with copies of bylaws in hand. She framed the garden as a threat to order, an encroachment on the tidy suburban vision she fought to uphold. Not all board members were convinced. A few exchanged uneasy glances as Karen railed on, sensing her fixation was beginning to appear obsessive. But Karen's influence was strong, and most nodded along out of habit. She had been president for years, wielding authority with the precision of someone who thrived on control. To defy her was to invite scrutiny. Meanwhile, the homeowner began documenting everything. Every notice, every letter, every picture of the garden at each stage. What began as an act of defense became a growing record of transformation. The homeowner wasn't only tending to plants, but curating a timeline. A story unfolding in petals and leaves, a narrative far greater than the confines of HOA bylaws. As summer deepened, so too did the garden's beauty. News traveled beyond the neighborhood. Passers-by began pausing not in disapproval, but in admiration. Joggers slowed to snap photos with their phones. Children pulled parents closer to the yard, pointing at butterflies dancing above milkweed and lavender. Some even knocked on the door to compliment the display. What Karen saw as chaos, strangers recognized as art. This outside attention unsettled Karen. She noticed unfamiliar cars slowing as they passed, drivers leaning out to take pictures. To her, this was not admiration, but disruption. She sent yet another notice, this one sharper, more severe, warning of potential fines if the garden was not brought into compliance. The language of the letter was sterile, but beneath it, the message was clear. Karen wanted victory, not compromise. But an unexpected twist began to take shape. One afternoon, a local gardening club visited, having heard whispers of a yard turning heads in a controlled suburban development they came to see for themselves. Cameras clicked, notebooks filled with observations, and soon after, the homeowner was invited to submit the garden for a state-level competition celebrating sustainable landscapes. The homeowner accepted without hesitation. It was an act of defiance wrapped in creativity, a way to fight Karen not through confrontation, but by amplifying the garden's worth. Karen, of course, caught wind of this development almost immediately. To her, it was an affront, a direct challenge to her authority. She doubled down, calling emergency HOA meetings, insisting the board take decisive action. Yet, cracks in her influence widened. Some members questioned whether constant battles over one resident's garden truly represented the community's best interest. Still, Karen pressed on, her fixation now bordering on obsession. The homeowner, meanwhile, felt a sense of transformation within. What had begun as a quiet act of personal expression had grown into something larger, a statement about individuality, resilience, and the power of creation against control. Nights were spent under the warm glow of porch lights, sketching new ideas for plant arrangements, researching soil enrichment, and mapping seasonal blooms. Neighbors began whispering too, but not in the way Karen expected. Conversations on the sidewalk shifted from gossip about messy plants to admiration for the resilience of the homeowner facing constant pressure. Parents pointed out the yard as an example of natural beauty to their children. For many, it became a quiet symbol of standing up to unreasonable control. By late summer, the competition judges announced their shortlists. The homeowner's garden had not only been accepted, but was named a finalist. A photographer from a regional magazine visited to document the story, capturing the vibrant chaos of color against the backdrop of a strict suburban neighborhood. When the article was published, the garden appeared in glossy print. Nature's Rebellion in the Suburbs. The feature celebrated the homeowner's creativity, sustainable choices, and resilience against opposition. Karen's scowls grew deeper when she saw copies circulating on driveways and coffee tables throughout the community. What she had framed as disorder was now publicly celebrated as art. The HOA board could not ignore the shifting tide. Pressure mounted from residents who were increasingly embarrassed by Karen's obsession, especially as the garden gained more recognition. Some even wondered aloud whether Karen's actions might expose the HOA to legal trouble. Yet Karen, blinded by anger, was not finished. She vowed to stop the garden before the final stage of the competition. In her mind, the neighborhood could not be allowed to become a spectacle, at least not one outside of her control. And so the conflict, already simmering for months, reached its boiling point. Karen plotted her next move, unaware that her efforts would soon backfire in the most humiliating way possible. The stage was set. Recognition was turning into fame, neighbors into allies, and the garden itself into a story bigger than anyone had imagined. Karen's downfall had begun, though she could not yet see it. The months that followed were a whirlwind. The garden that had once been branded as a messy jungle became a point of pride, not only for the homeowner, but for the entire neighborhood. What had started as a simple act of personal joy, planting flowers, arranging pathways, and cultivating a space of peace, was about to erupt into a public spectacle that neither Karen nor the HOA board could control. By late summer, the homeowner's yard had fully matured into something breathtaking. Flowers bloomed in staggered waves, each bed offering a new splash of color week after week. Climbing roses framed the entrance, wildflowers spilled across the lawn in carefully planned chaos, and butterflies drifted lazily through the air as if the space had been designed for them. Neighbors, once silent or skeptical, began to stop and take pictures. Children tugged their parents toward the garden on evening walks. Slowly, word spread beyond the street. It began with a local gardening club that shared photos on social media, praising the creative design and ecological richness of the space. The post gained traction, attracting hundreds of likes and comments. Soon after, a local lifestyle blogger featured the garden in an article, praising it as a hidden gem of suburban beauty. The attention snowballed, and before long the garden had caught the eye of organizers for a national gardening competition. An official letter arrived one crisp morning, its envelope stamped with the logo of a prestigious gardening association. The homeowner opened it with trembling hands. The message was clear. Their garden had been nominated for a national award for innovative residential landscaping. It was a recognition of not just the beauty of the space, but the creativity, sustainability, and vision that had shaped it. The news spread quickly. Neighbors congratulated the homeowner in passing, their voices carrying a mixture of genuine admiration and astonishment. But none reacted more sharply than Karen. Karen, who had spent the past year filing complaints, demanding fines and even lobbying for the removal of the messy garden, now found herself in an impossible position. The very project she had tried to dismantle was being praised by experts and celebrated by outsiders. She tried to downplay it, muttering to anyone who would listen that awards didn't change the rules or the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. Yet her voice, once commanding at HOA meetings, now carried little weight. People had grown tired of her constant complaints, especially when faced with undeniable proof that her judgment had been wrong. On the day of the award ceremony, a local news crew set up cameras outside the house. The homeowner stood proudly in front of the glowing garden as reporters interviewed them about the journey. They spoke of resilience, creativity, and the joy of nurturing life. Karen hovered on the sidewalk, her arms crossed, her lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. She refused to be interviewed, but her presence was impossible to ignore. The following week, the garden was featured in a national magazine. Photographs of its vibrant colors filled glossy pages, alongside an article celebrating the transformation of a suburban yard into a masterpiece of natural design. The magazine issue circulated widely, shared across social media, with readers applauding the vision and perseverance behind it. What made the moment even more satisfying was that the article mentioned the early resistance from the local HOA. Though names were not given, it was clear to everyone who the HOA president opposed to the design referred to. Karen's reputation, once untouchable in the neighborhood, began to crumble. For years, Karen had built her authority on fear. Fear of fines, fear of confrontation, fear of her unrelenting judgment. But now, people saw her differently. She was no longer the enforcer of standards, but the antagonist in a story that had embarrassed the entire HOA board on a national stage. Even other board members began distancing themselves from her, some privately apologizing to the homeowner for ever supporting her claims. The ripple effect was undeniable. Neighbors who had once conformed to strict, sterile lawns began experimenting with their yards. A few planted small flower beds, others installed bird feeders or trellises. The neighborhood, once uniform and rigid, began to show signs of individuality. Karen tried to resist, issuing warnings and citing rules, but with each attempt, she sounded more desperate and less authoritative. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was palpable. Residents filled the room, many of them carrying copies of the magazine or screenshots of the award announcement. Karen sat at the head of the table, her posture stiff, her face flushed with indignation. She attempted to call the meeting to order, but her words were drowned out by the voices of neighbors demanding change. They wanted updated rules, more flexibility, and an end to the petty policing that had defined their community for years. For the first time, Karen's gavel did not command silence. Instead, it was met with murmurs of disapproval, then open criticism. The board, sensing the shift, voted to revise the landscaping rules to allow greater creativity and personal expression. It was a sweeping change that effectively erased the restrictions Karen had wielded for so long. Karen's fury was visible, but her influence had evaporated. She could no longer control the narrative. What had started as her crusade against one homeowner's garden had ended in her public downfall. The very garden she had tried to destroy had instead destroyed her authority. Months later, the garden remained a vibrant sanctuary, now more than just a personal space. It had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that sometimes standing firm against unfair rules and unreasonable authority could change more than just one yard. It could transform an entire community. Karen, meanwhile, grew quieter. She still attended meetings, still carried her stack of papers and her air of superiority, but people no longer looked at her with fear. They looked at her with pity or indifference. She had become a relic of an old order, overshadowed by the bright, living beauty of the garden that had triumphed over her. And as the seasons turned, the garden flourished, each bloom carrying with it the memory of a battle won, not just for one homeowner, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by the unreasonable grip of a Karen and her HOA board. It wasn't just a victory, it was vindication,